This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
Very much looking forward to feedback and discussion. Some of this is really, really new stuff, so to speak. So I'm glad to get feedback. So I changed the title a little bit, slightly bit to substrate hybrid systems in the context of artificial consciousness. You will see why this is in a second, but it's just a minor issue. And as Andrew has kindly introduced me, or has introduced me so kindly, I'm at the moment at the Czech Academy of the Sciences, and I'm also at the UVGU Magdeburg. Okay, anyway, I will directly start. So the big question that we, of course, have with AI and consciousness is whether artificial systems can become conscious. And I think, as most of you know, there are these like two very broad philosophical frameworks that might contribute to this question. So there is computational functionalism that, of course, would say that artificial systems can be conscious because computational functionalism claims that consciousness is something computable, and any system that computes these computations would be conscious. So, of course, computational functionalism doesn't care much about the substrate. And then there is biological naturalism. But biological naturalism would, of course, also be fine with artificial consciousness, as long as the substrate would be biological, because in biological naturalism, consciousness is, in some sense, a biological property. I will, of course, unpack this a bit more later. And as you might have recognized, I will use the big C for consciousness. That saves me some space on the slides. Okay, so what about AI, artificial intelligence? This notion today specifically refers to artificial neural networks. So I will not talk about symbolic AI or other types of AI. The idea is that we have artificial neural networks, ANNs, of which DNNs, deep neural networks, are a specific category, and LLMs are even a more specific category, but the broad notion is ANN. And these are universal function approximators. But crucially, they run on silicon-based digital classical computers. So even though we compute neural networks, on the hardware side or on the substrate side, we still have digital systems, and biological naturalists are skeptical about consciousness in silicon-based machines. And therefore, insofar as they are fine to attribute intelligence to such a system, they would distinguish the capacity of intelligence from the capacity for consciousness, so that from the viewpoint of biological naturalism, intelligence and consciousness can be distinguished. ChatGPT might be intelligent, but not conscious in this framework. So the point I want to make is that the debate between biological naturalism and computational functionalism is often based on an implicit assumption, namely the substrate uniformity of a system. So that we talk about a system in the sense that the whole system is of the same substrate. And I think that it's worth to consider substrate hybrid systems, actually for two reasons: because they become technically feasible, I think, but also because I think that this really helps to think about and engage with philosophical frameworks and thought experiments, more precisely the replacement scenarios. So a substrate hybrid system, the term is of course broad, and I will also right at the end of the talk give a bit of an idea of limitations to the way I use it. But here I want to make clear that the way I use the term in the talk is really to refer to systems that are partly biological and partly silicon-based, and in some sense are fused, intertwined, or closely interact. And I will analyze when such systems could be considered conscious from a biological naturalist point of view. For a computational functionalist, he or she wouldn't care anyway, but I will also try to give some arguments actually why I am more and more interested in biological naturalism and try to defend this view a bit. So in order to do that, I will try to counter a specific replacement argument. The dancing qualia argument, I know that's a bit old, I'm late to the party, but I think that the hybrid systems can kind of like actually shed a new perspective on these kinds of arguments. So this is the outline. I will talk about biological naturalism. I will talk about substrate hybrid systems, consciousness, replacement scenarios, and then in the end, I will give you some limitations. Okay. Biological naturalism is this thesis that consciousness is a biological property. And of course, anyone who hears it asks, okay, what is a biological property? And I think Aniel Seth did a great job in spelling it out, or kind of like giving an overview about possible ways to spell it out in his recent BBS paper. So there are strong substrate dependence biological naturalist views that where the strongest form would be something like a metaphysical structuralism. Consciousness depends, metaphysical biological naturalism. Consciousness depends on something like a biological essence, that there's something like intrinsic biological properties, whatever. I'm not a fan of this view. I'm not fully sure what this is supposed to mean, but you can maybe formulate something like this. A less stronger, but still very strong view is the idea that consciousness relates to life, so that only living systems can be conscious, that consciousness is a property of living systems. And then you would all only allow for artificial consciousness if you would allow for artificial life. It's unclear whether we can achieve something like this. It's a bit of a different topic. I will not consider this further. Then there are the weak substrate dependence views that I think are really in between biological naturalism and functionalism. So one could argue that consciousness depends on very specific computational functions, but these can only be carried out by biological systems. Apparently, that's a view Chalmers mentioned. I just found it in the Seth review, which could be called computational biological naturalism. And then there's this view, as Seth phrases it, that maybe consciousness depends on non-computational functional properties of biological systems. I think here's a slight shift of meaning in functional. We go from kind of like causal role functionalism to something like teleosemantic functionalism. But I think if we just simplify it, I think this means that it's about the physics of the system. So I think something like McFadden's electromagnetic theory, maybe quantum theories also could be employed here. And when they argue, or if they would argue that consciousness requires biology to kind of like implement these physical properties. My view is structuralism. I'm not fully sure whether how close this is to biological naturalism at the moment, but I would make the following case. I would think that metaphysically speaking, it does not make much sense to speak of consciousness as biological. I think strong consciousness is a specific structure in a very high dimensional space. But I think this space should entail a time dimension. I think consciousness is something that requires time in a strong sense, and I'm a holist. And I think one could at least make a case for biological naturalism from this perspective in claiming that at least so far we only know that biological systems can integrate information across different levels of processing, which I find an interesting aspect of consciousness, or something I find worth hypothesizing, that actually consciousness is something that transgresses different levels of organization. And only biological systems have these robust temporal properties. So there's no notion of time for ChatGPT. For example, you cannot ask ChatGPT, wait 5 seconds with the answer or something. It's just not how the system works. So that's why I'm interested in biological naturalism. I would call this pretty contingent view, contingent interest in biological naturalism. But yeah, just to lay out what I think. I also want to point out to this notion of mortal computation here, which I find very intriguing, coined by Geoffrey Hinton, who claimed that if parameter values are only useful for that specific hardware instance, then the computation they perform is mortal. It dies with the hardware. So the idea is that maybe specific computations that are actually very time dependent, they only exist through a specific period of time. And as Johannes argued, maybe this is important for consciousness. I find these ideas very intriguing, that biological systems may be the only systems, at least in our world, in which a strong relationship between hardware and software can be achieved. But you don't have to follow me on this. Regardless of the specific interpretation of biological naturalism, I am now pursuing the following question. So for any one of you who is subscribing to just one of all these like possibilities of biological naturalism that I just showed you, the following questions will be interesting. And for the computational functionalists among you, I hope you also find some interest in what I'm going to say. So the question I'm now pursuing is, if consciousness is substrate dependent, doesn't matter whether it's weak or strong or whatever, on biological systems, under what scenarios would substrate-hybrid systems be conscious? In short, if biology somehow matters, under which circumstances could hybrid systems become conscious? I think this is interesting in and of itself, because, as I want to show you now, these hybrid systems might be a technical possibility. And we will revisit the specific interpretations of biological naturalism later. Okay, if your guys are still on board, I will now turn to the substrate hybrid system, maybe have a sip of tea. Okay, I think one version of a substrate hybrid system is widely known, also, of course, in philosophy and these replacement arguments, is the idea that if you implement a neuroprosthesis into the brain, that's a hybrid system. Under my definition, we have a silicon-based substrate that is implemented in an otherwise biological system, and this requires some kind of interface that translates the digital signals by the prosthesis into biological neuronal spice and vice versa. But what I think is now very interesting is the idea of reversing this process. So in a sense, we can have a reverse or inverse neuroprosthesis in the sense that we have a silicon-based system, and now we think about what happens if we implement brain slices or organoids into these systems. And some of you might wonder now, okay, but what the heck are organoids and brain slices? And now I will review some science. So an organoid is any organ that is grown from pluripotent stem cells. So they are liver organoids, they are heart organoids, and so on. But for our purposes, I think brain organoids are especially interesting, though. So these are stem cell grown mini brains. It's crucial for something to be an organoid that it is three-dimensional. And as I said, typically grown from pluripotent stem cells, but you can also grow them from, for example, fetal human cells. And on the right, you see a picture of an organoid. I will in a second tell you more about this picture. The research actually accelerated a lot during the last decade. I guess many of you have read about it or about this research. I think one major breakthrough was in 2019, where it was shown that brain organoids show realistic neuronal firing rhythms. You can also see how small they are on the picture and these little balls in the dish. And it's maybe important to still point out some disanalogies between brain organoids and human brains. So they don't have a vascular system. People are improving, neuroscientists, in controlling the variability, but it's still very high. They, of course, don't live very long, and they also don't have microglia. Still, it's very interesting what's happening there. So in 2020, Anderson et al. Presented the assembloid approach. So you can grow different organoids and then assemble them in a second step into a larger system composing of parts. And I think this is interesting because you get this kind of like semi-modular architectures that I think we also find in the brain. So here on the pictures, that's the same picture I had on the slide before, and you see an assembloid because the kind of like the big ball is a forebrain organoid. So an interesting aspect of these systems is that they are already a bit specific, so you can have different brain parts organoids. It's still very early, it's still very like in development, but I find it impressive and very interesting. And these little brownish-like balls are optical vesicles. So these are kind of like four forms of eyes. And actually, the study was conducted to study eye development, but for simple geometric reasons, it's not possible to grow eyes in the petri dish without having a forebrain connected to it. So they developed this assembloid approach to grow these optical vesicles together with this forebrain. And then in 2025, actually a four-part assembloid was created. So here, and this was to model the ascending neurosensory pathway. I will just read from the abstract: a four-part assembloid generated from human pluripotent stem cells that integrate somatosensory, spinal, thalamic, and cortical organoids to model the spinothalamic pathway. So that's very impressive. And I think that an interesting part now is to think about, okay, could we come to a point where we assemble not only biological systems, but maybe also other substrate in it? So in a sense, a substrate hybrid could be defined as an assembloid that contains non-biological hardware. I know this is stretching the term, so I don't want to advertise it too strong. But yeah, just to, I don't know, give you another angle to kind of like look at this. And I also want to briefly mention the notion of brain slice. So a brain slice is a two-dimensional slice of active cells. You see it on the right on the picture, mounted on an electrode, multi-electrode array. And then if the brain slice is removed from a living brain, then it's a neurotypical brain slice, as opposed to, for example, a stem cell grown brain slice. And here we have the first example of a hybrid system. In the sense I have it in mind. You may know this study. It's by Kagan et al., also co-authored with Carl Fürsten, and they created this dish brain system. So they have brain slices works for both human neurons and mouse neurons, and they are mounted on this multi-electrode array chips. You see it in the middle, and this multi-electrode array chip can give inputs to the brain slices, can receive it outputs, and it can also modulate its synaptic growth. Although it's still hard to control learning in organoids or brain slices for that matter, but it was possible to train this biological brain slice to play the video game Pong. It's not 100% performance. It's still within limits. It's based on on ideas from the free energy principle, but still, I think it's very, very impressive. And now I think as technically I'm a philosopher, so I'm allowed, I think, to speculate a bit. And in order for making things a bit more graspable for us, in order to have some simplified models to work with, I will consider two scenarios for how these hybrid systems or what kind of hybrid systems could emerge in the future, or two ways to set it up. I have two disclaimers. Both scenarios require recurrent connections. I am not considering it here that I like that the LLMs, which are as you know, the most famous artificial neural networks at the moment, are purely feed forward. I will sidestep this issue. And there are many more possible scenarios. As said, I will also talk about this a bit more in the limitations later. Okay, the outsourcing scenario I base on a study by Kai et al., and they used organoids in the context of computational reservoir. Reservoir computing is a branch of physical computing, analog computing, where you use the natural dynamics of a physical systems to perform computations. Not any system can be used as a reservoir. It needs to have a sufficiently complex state space, and it also is not allowed to have memory. So past inputs shouldn't influence the dynamics. And there are some more considerations, but that doesn't matter here. The idea is that what you see in the study is they created this system where you see it at the top right of the graphic. You give input with an artificial neural network to the brain organoid, which just through its physics reacts to this input in a certain way. And then on the output side, you have another artificial neural network that is trained on the input, on the relationship between the input and the dynamics of the organoid, and then kind of like reads it out. And the idea is that it's computationally and more energy efficient to have this organoid as the step in between. That is, in a sense, cheaper than training artificial neural networks to do the full job. And again, this works with multi-electrode array chips and so on. They call the system brain aware. And the interesting thing is that this is also interesting for reservoir computing in general, because now you have a reservoir that is in a sense adaptive. So you can influence its state space dynamics, again, depending on how well we become technically to control the organoids. But nevertheless, very interesting. Such a system can be trained to recognize vowels. And I call it the outsourcing scenario because I extrapolate from that. Maybe in the future we will have for some very specific computations, we will use biological systems because they are just more energy efficient. Or if mortal computation is a thing, they are just the only systems that can carry out certain computations. But maybe we will only use it for part of the system because it's expensive to train, to create organoids. You have to keep them alive and everything. So it might make sense to only use them for very specific computations, maybe akin to how it's discussed with quantum computers these days. The second scenario is even a bit more science fiction. So I think of a scenario where we use biological systems as controllers of silicon-based systems. So a controller is a system that regulates the parameters of other systems. For example, a thermostat regulates heating. Control theory has, of course, been applied to neural systems, but the point I want to make here is that maybe in the future, we will have systems where, as I said, organoids control multiple ANNs. I like the graphic that the AI Microsoft designer created. So it depicted the brain using a keyboard and the mouse to interact with the computer. But I have more something like this in mind, where you would have like a centralized biological system that throughout its recurrent properties can process and regulate kind of like silicon-based local processors. You will already see that this is a loose analogy, maybe to the global neuronal workspace. I will come back to this later. The idea is that maybe what biology is good for, or biological systems are good for as hardware is the strong recurrency, and as I mentioned, integration of different timescales and levels, maybe because recurrent systems if we have recurrent ANNs, they are very inefficient. That's, I guess, one reason why people stick with feed-forward networks in the context of AI nowadays. But maybe actually we can exploit the benefits of recurrency if we use biological systems for these aspects, and the kind of like more controllable, more programmable silicon-based systems for pure feed-forward processing. Disclaimer, none of what has been said should be confused with silicon-based neuromorphic computing. This is yet another topic, that's another branch of research where people try to build silicon-based chips more closely to the structure, to the computational structure of artificial neural networks. So we are still in the realm of silicon systems. However, their processing structure is to be made more analogous to neural networks. I think that's somewhere intermediate, and I think depending on what these like and how far these neuromorphic chips can instantiate the structures required for consciousness, they are either more on the biological or more on the silicon-based side. I will not consider it further, but just to mention that. Okay, I hope you're still with me. I think I talked how long? 15 minutes. So I still have half an hour left. Yeah, I hope you still have capacity for more. Now, the big topic of consciousness. What is consciousness? Okay, no one knows, right? No one really knows. But I think what what is useful in considering hybrid system is to talk about a specific meta-theoretical distinction, in the sense that it applies to several theories of consciousness. You don't have to follow me on this theoretical distinction now. I will also provide you with an alternative later. But for now, we start with this distinction between consciousness and content. So that's first and foremost a conceptual distinction. The idea is that you can distinguish the contents, the things that appear in subjective consciousness, from the fact that they are conscious. For example, I can be conscious of color content, but color content can also be processed unconsciously. I think this is one of the basic assumptions of consciousness science nowadays. So to make it a bit more illustrative, when I ride the bicycle at night and I'm lost in thoughts, I would still react to red and green traffic lights, but maybe not be subjectively conscious of them. So one could say that that explaining how the brain processes color is, in a sense, a bit different from the question of why the brain makes it conscious sometimes, or what this consciousness thing is. So I think on a theoretical level, the idea would be that if you follow this distinction, then the idea is that we can have theories that explain the encoding of color, for example, by color space structures in visual cortex 4, and then we might need a second theory that explains when and how this could become conscious. I think here it's not that I follow this view strongly, but just as an example, higher order thought theory is not a theory about how contents are encoded in the brain or processed in the brain. It's a theory about how and when they become conscious. So you have this kind of like two-step way of thinking, and this two-step way of thinking my colleagues and I have called the two-factor approach. So you first explain content, how the brain encodes content, and then in a second step, you want to explain how and when these contents become conscious. And I think if this two-factor way of thinking is correct, then I think nothing stands in the way of conceiving of content and consciousness to be actually physically distinguished. So maybe content and consciousness supervene on different parts of the system. I think, I mean, of course, this is very simplified, but if we think about these ideas that maybe in the sensory cortices in V4, you have the content, and then in the prefrontal cortex, you have the consciousness that somehow accesses these contents or re-represents them or whatever. Then I see no reason why the visual cortex, so to speak, could not be of a different substrate than whatever is instantiated by these prefrontal systems. And I think this yields a novel theoretical position. I will in a second say why I think it's novel and has not been considered so much, which I call two-factor biological naturalism. This view follows the distinction between consciousness and content and only applies biological naturalism to the consciousness factor. It doesn't care if the contents are processed silicon-based. So only the consciousness factor must supervene on biology. And as I said, I will discuss criticism and problems with this view in a second. But for now, let me map the distinction between consciousness and content onto these control and outsourcing scenarios that I presented to you earlier. These were these like organoid and silicon-based hybrid system scenarios. So in the outsourcing scenario, I would say that content, this was this reservoir computing. I would say that content would be computed in the organoid, but then decoded or accessed by the artificial neural network as it was in this brain-aware system by Kai et al. In the control scenario, things would be the other way around. The contents could be computed by silicon-based artificial neural networks and then decoded or accessed by the organoid. This was the idea of having this kind of like biological system as a centralized hub. And so now we can start to make some predictions. So in the control scenario, the consciousness factor would be biological based on this two-factor consideration. In the outsource scenario, it would not be. So if you look into the table, you see on the left-hand side the scenarios, the control scenarios, in the sense that the organoid is an access system. In the outsourcing scenario, the organoid is a content processing system. And then on the right, you see the implications from this two-factor biological naturalism view. However, I think the reason why this two-factor biological naturalism has not been strongly developed is because it's somehow it doesn't fit the spirit of biological naturalism. So I don't know if you would follow me in this way of talking, but I think sometimes there are positions that are logically possible that kind of like occupy a viable position in the space of possible philosophical views, but they do not really match in spirit to the views that they are normally related to, because I think biological naturalism is often very much related to theories of consciousness that are very local and very early, and where they think that consciousness is something very simple, whereas the idea that consciousness is something more complex, more prefrontal cortex related, often is more closely combined with functionalist views. The idea that you need that it's about a specific complexity of processing or so. So I think many biological naturalists are one-factor theorists in the sense that they assume that biology, if you have a biological system that explains the contents appearing in consciousness and the fact that they are experience consciously, they don't make this distinction. I think biological naturalists prefer first-order views. Yes, so this would be one-factor biological naturalism. Both content and consciousness supervene on the same biological system. We can map this again to these two scenarios that I presented to you. So in the control scenario, it would not be the case that the contents would be processed by the system. So maybe the system would only do regulation of the other systems, or it would do distribution of information or access, but it would, in some sense, not encode the content, unless one would assume that the controller somehow re-encodes or re-represents the contents. I think this reflects kind of like a certain ambiguity in global neuronal workspace theory, for example, where you can ask whether, in the sense, the contents still stay in the local hubs and then somehow information about them is distributed to other systems, or whether, in the sense, the content enters the global workspace, is re-represented there. I think similar considerations apply to higher order theories that can be either re-representational or, for example, there are other views like this pointer high order theory and so on. So we have, on the control side, we have this kind of like with re-representation, without re-representation kind of view. And in the outsourcing scenario, I think there could be, you have content processing, but you have no multimodal integration. You have no cognitive functions related to it. It's really just very basic information processing. So there could be consciousness in this scenario under one-factor biological naturalism, but only if you have a very low bar of consciousness. And I think also only you would have something like isolated consciousness, maybe related to these ideas of islands of awareness. So these would be my predictions here. In the control scenario, you would not have consciousness in the hybrid system as a whole under one-factor biological naturalism, but in this re-encoding scenario, you would have it, and in the outsourcing scenario, it would could only be, in a sense, isolated, not multimodally integrated. So this is the table. I will show it to you later, but now I will show it at the end of the talk again, so we can discuss it. I'm happy to hear what you think about it, but for now, I wanna take all these considerations into higher levels or more abstract levels of philosophy. So in the sense we were now at the intermediate part between science and philosophy, and before we discussed some pure science, now we go more into pure philosophy. Okay, I hope you're ready. So I want to use these hybrid systems and this way of thinking about kind of like putting systems together and thinking about how this relates to consciousness to the replacement scenarios. More specifically to the dancing qualia argument. So I think it's, of course, very interesting, and that's future work to be done to relate it more broadly. But due to time constraints, I will focus on the dancing qualia. I will introduce it in a second, but just note that the replacement arguments, as outlined by Chalmers in his paper on dancing and fading qualia, and then also reprinted in his dissertation, The Conscious Mind. These are reductios ad absurdum to disprove biological naturalism. So since I'm not making a case for the strong substrate-dependent biological naturalism views, but I think it's as I said, I have some sympathy for concepts like mortal computation and so on in the context of consciousness. So I want to kind of like defend biological naturalism a bit against these views now. Mm. But for those of you who don't know them, like the replacement scenarios, if we consider the dancing qualia argument, the idea is that you could create two functionally identical circuits of different substrates in a single brain and switch between them. So, for example, I don't know, if V4 matters for consciousness, whatever, in my brain, then the idea would be to implement a second visual cortex, but based on silicon-based hardware, and then to have, in a sense, a possibility to have two pathways, one through each, and then at some point you just switch between them. But crucially, the idea is that they are functionally identical. So it wouldn't matter for the processing of the rest of the brain. The idea is here to kind of like screen off the functional properties from the substrate and keep the functional properties constant while manipulating the substrate. And the idea is that what would happen then is that you could, if for the sake of the reductio, Dave Chalmers assumes that biological naturalism is true, or that substrate somehow matters. But if the substrate matters, independently of the functional properties, you could alter the qualia through switching between the circuits without any functional differences. So this is ex hypothesis. And these are the dancing qualia. Like if I switch between the substrate, but nothing changes functionally, still on the view that substrate matters, the qualia should vary with the variation of the substrate. And this leads to the absurd consequence that underscores the reductio, namely that introspection, or at least our belief formation about our own qualitative states, depends only on the functional roles. So the idea would be that if substrate matters, but functional properties do not, you can have dancing qualia without noticing it, in a sense, without forming the belief that you have them. This is considered absurd, and therefore biological naturalism is rejected. I want to make another point, or connect it to another argument. I think actually the dancing qualia argument generalizes awkwardly beyond the substrate. I think it also generalizes to what I would call architectural constraints. As most of you will remember, Durick et al. Argued in the unfolding argument that recurrent and feed-forward systems are functionally equivalent. So the difference between recurrency and the feed-forward system, I would call it a difference in architecture. It's just a notion I would use. I don't know, maybe you guys have a better one. And if the unfolding argument goes through, you can, I think, construe a dancing qualia case with it as well, because you could say, I know it's not biologically possible or whatever, but just to construe the case, if you have a feed-forward system and you have the recurrent system, and you could switch between them and they are functionally equivalent, you can also get, in a very abstract sense, dancing qualia without noticing it. I know here, especially against the unfolding argument, there were all these arguments against that this is biologically implausible, that this doesn't fit evolution, and so on. I'm not denying that. I'm also not arguing in favor of the unfolding argument. It's just that I think that there is something that these arguments connect, and I think that what these arguments overlook is that most theories of consciousness do focus on architecture. I don't, if I read even global neuronal workspace papers and so on, I don't have the feeling that it's that broadly functional as it was in the 80s and as it's sometimes depicted by maybe authors like Adrian Durick and others. So I do think that actually most theories of consciousness do rely on this architecture. Is consciousness something that can be implemented feed forward versus recurrent? Is it a higher order system? Is it a global workspace with these long range recurrent connections and so on? And I think we should think about how these arguments should be blocked. In my understanding, these arguments construe consciousness to be too, like, have a notion of functional role that is too broad. Um, and I think an important point to make here is that there is this implicit premise in there that it's actually nomologically possible to replace a system with a functional equivalent. So the idea is that if we say it's conceivable, I think it's meant to be in the sense of nomological possibility because the whole argument is set in a nomological setting. As we all know, David Chalmers is metaphysically speaking more open to dualism and panpsychism. We are here only speaking about what is possible in our world based on the natural laws that we have. And I think, of course, the other rebuttals of the unfolding argument, like the evolutionary arguments and so on, they go in a similar direction. But I think I want to point out an additional aspect. Namely, I want to argue that it's actually nomologically impossible to do the replacement under functional equivalence in the first place. So it's not only technical reasons. I think there are deep reasons why we cannot do it. And this is what I would challenge. I see this, this slide is a bit repeating. Okay, the idea is I want to challenge the idea of replacement under functional equivalence. And if we, for example, go back to the mortal computations, I think that's a useful way to think about it is that these are by definition time dependent. So if something is mortal, it exists or it lives in a sense, broadly speaking, for some time and then it dies. If consciousness, as Johannes argued, would depend on such mortal computations, for example, then the dynamics of the past, present, and future matter. In a sense, consciousness would extend into time. But this is not this does not hinge on the specific notion of mortal computation specifically. It's also a bit what I had as starting hypotheses when I presented my structuralist view. We can discuss the motivations for this later in the discussion. But what I want to point out is, or the assumption I make is that consciousness cannot exist at one single point in time. I think it's something that exists that extends in over a certain amount of time. And the idea that you can replace a system without any functional difference, I think entails a certain assumption about the temporal properties of this replacement, namely that you can, in a sense, replace faster than the time it takes to have the belief updates, in a sense. And I don't think that this is possible. Because when we think about the organoids and the assembling and the ideas of the hybrid systems, I think this points to the fact that time is actually something very important here, because these systems, in a sense, have to grow together. And the point I want to make is that this growing is not required because we are, as humans, to just build these systems, to build them from scratch. I think that there is something about the way our world functions, that you need the time that these processes need time. And I think it's impossible nomologically to shield functional properties from replacement because of the temporal processes. So I'm not sure which words to use here, and this still needs to be developed also in relation to issues in philosophy of time. But I think consciousness, these temporal processes that are required or that are important could be called maybe an abstract form of learning, maybe something like merging, fusing, coalescing, coordinating in a sense. Here I'm still kind of like looking for the right term and to really philosophically spell that out, also in relations to issues in contingency and necessity and so on. But I think time is important. And I think that this is not considered. You can see in this quote from Dave Chalmers. So he wrote, for two systems to share their functional organization, they must be in correspondent states at the time in question. And I think that's actually an issue with the whole idea of replacement, that is a bit under considered, or at least maybe you guys can point me to to some literature that goes into this direction. I think consciousness cannot be confined to a single moment in time, and this already blocks the whole argument. So I think replacement scenarios do not indirectly prove functionalism. I think they only show that immediate replacement leads to absurd consequences, not biological naturalism. Because I think biological naturalism especially can be married, so to speak, with the notion that consciousness, that it has these specific dynamics over time and this time extension. Okay, I'm almost done. I might even be a bit earlier. So then the last part of the talk is again a bit more technical. I'm not talking about the kind of like philosophical, argumentative limitations of what I presented before. I wanted to point out a bit more possibilities regarding the hybrid systems and some things I haven't considered and some things I find interesting and yet not know what to do with them. Okay, so first of all, I found very interesting when I recently reread The View from Nowhere from Thomas Nagel, which was published in 1986, that he actually conceived of something like organoids already. He wrote that it might even be possible by some monstrosity of genetic engineering to produce a brain that had never been part of an animal, but was nevertheless an individual subject. So I think what he's foreshadowing here is the question whether an organoid, a stem cell grown system, can have consciousness in the sense of individual perspective to the world. We might approach the situation, but there are two reviews that caution, like that say that we should be more cautious regarding consciousness in organoids. Maybe yet. So I just want to show you these papers by James Croxford and Tim Bay in the case against organoid consciousness, where they argue heavily on considerations of representational properties and embodiment. And then there's this great review by neuroscientist Kenneth Kosick, Why Brain Organoids Are Not Conscious Yet. Regarding the embodiment and the representation, I just want to present you something else, which I found kind of scary. So I will cite from a Nature News article. They wrote, a team at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, announced that it had at least partially restored life to the brains of pigs that had been killed hours earlier. The emphasis is by me. It's much more likely that an intact brain from a recently killed pig has the necessary structures for consciousness, as well as wiring created by memories and experiences the animal had while it was alive. So here we have another case, namely not a stem cell grown brain, but a brain that is removed from a previously living animal. I think ethically, of course, this is outrageous, but I don't know how you feel at the moment. Things politically do not go so well. I don't know how far humans will go. And in a dark science fiction scenario, I think there could be hybrid systems that involve brains that have been removed from living animals. If there is some advantage to doing that versus growing them, I think technically there speaks nothing against having hybrid system based on brains that have been part of embodied living systems before. There's also the possibility of species hybrids that in another sense challenges intuitions about consciousness. So here I quote from the review from Kenneth Kosick, because I think he really nicely summarizes the study. He wrote, when transplanted into the somatosensory cortex of newborn rats, human stem cell-derived cortical organoids integrated in the sensory and motivation-related circuits. So what people did, they grew organoids from human pluripotent stem cells and put them into a rat brain. And in the rat brain, they became functional. This observation suggests that the processing of a sensory input to a rat brain can partially occur in human neurons, and the encoding structure within the human organoid can be loaded with rat experience. My emphasis, again, I think this is a bit, I don't know what to make of this phrasing. So he depicted it in the way that you have the human organoid in the rat brain, and the human organoid integrates into the processing of the rat brain. And then still there's a specific encoding structure to the human organoid, but it's loaded with rat experience. I'm not yet sure what to make out of it, but this is something that we might consider as philosophers and scientists of consciousness. What about interspecies hybrids? What if consciousness is only distributed among specific species? Or what if there are specific kinds of consciousness attached to different species, and then we start like merging brains of different species? Or yeah, whatsoever. I think that's interesting. Something else I haven't considered and want to consider in the future is the idea of nanohybrids. So we also make progress in terms of nanotechnology. What about what if we have cells that have non-biological substrates implemented into them? What about silicon and biological system interactions on really the micro scale? I think this, of course, highly depends on how much consciousness depends on these micro scales, but still, I think something we have to consider and haven't really caught up yet. And with that, I will end. And as promised, I will present you this table from the first part of the talk. And I'm very happy to hear thoughts and considerations.